by the number of Israeli venture capitalists and Bahraini and UAE tech startups that have called me up in the past year asking to be connected, the Abraham Accords are going to be enduring. So thank you all. We now have a wonderful conversation for you between two folks who know more about transforming large and sometimes lumbering institutions. Robert Gates, who of course has led the CIA, he has led the US Defense Department and Texas A&M, one of our large and stellar universities. And there's no better interlocutor for Bob than Jane Harman, who of course pushed in Congress for the transformation of our intelligence services after 9/11 as the ranking member of the House Intelligence Committee. Both of them have recently written books on the deep new thinking that's needed in American foreign policy. Bob's book is called Exercise of Power: American Failures, Successes, and a New Path Forward in the Post-Cold War World. And Jane's is called Insanity Defense: Why Our Failure to Confront Hard National Security Problems Make Us Less Safe. So I guess what we're answering here is, can the U.S. exercise power without going insane? Jane and Bob, please come on up. Thank you.
So we have a photo op to start. Are you excited? This is what bipartisanship looks like. Raise your hand. So this is a total delight for me. First of all, I love the Security Forum. I've been coming here as long as it's existed. I love the Aspen Strategy Group, where I've been a member for 25 years, probably less than Bob has, not sure. But I was thinking about how I got to know Bob Gates, and clearly we overlapped. He was the big shot in the Pentagon, and I was, a slightly senior member of a body that has collapsed into disarray. And that's not really where I got to know him. I got to know him here at the Aspen Strategy Group. It's a wonderful place for friendships, and to be a friend of Bob's is a high honor.
Thank you.
So there. So this is a 1.5 hour conversation. We're going to try to talk fast so we can get to a few questions, we hope. But let me start with what I was just talking about, bipartisanship. There was this old adage back in the day that criticism stops at the water's edge, and both parties, imagine that, just wrap your head around that, would stop criticizing the president of either party at the water's edge. But let's focus for a moment on the Congress. How can I avoid that? And what difference it makes. Bob would know, because Bob, as you know, was in the chairs not just as a Secretary of Defense who overlapped two presidents of different parties. I don't know if that ever happened before, but also as a very important member of the intelligence community and CIA director before that. So what difference, Bob, does bipartisanship make in fashioning and implementing foreign and security policy? And has the toxic relationship in the United States Congress hurt the U.S.'s ability to project leadership?
I think the most important benefit of bipartisanship in foreign policy is that it gives other countries a sense of confidence that U.S. policies will be sustained from one presidency to the next. One of the, I think, central reasons that we were successful in the Cold War was that we pursued a more or less consistent policy of containment through 9 successive presidents, so 45 years. And I think for other nations to be willing to rely on us to, in many respects, put their security in our hands, they have to have a sense that we are dependable, that we are reliable, and that if we make agreements, we'll stick to them no matter who is president. So I think that it's really important from that standpoint. I think there's a domestic component also. Most Americans don't care very much about what goes on in the rest of the world. And when the United States does need to act, it is more persuasive to Americans when they are hearing the same message from both Republicans and Democrats about why something is important, about why this is important for our country, for our economy, for our security. Now, I will say, I think Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin have accomplished something which no other living human beings have accomplished. That is, they have brought the Republicans and the Democrats together on Capitol Hill. And the truth is, except for a few outliers in both parties, on the far left and the far right, there is very strong bipartisan support for a tough line toward China and a tough line toward Russia, and particularly after the invasion of Ukraine. So there is a kernel, not a kernel, but a real foundation toward two central countries that are important for the future of bipartisanship that I think we can potentially build on. But once you get beyond those two countries, the Middle East, Latin America, Africa, arms control, climate, it all falls apart. There is no bipartisanship on any of those issues. And so even with respect to Russia or China, an arms control agreement would encounter, I think, huge opposition in the Congress and probably, depending on who proposed it, a partisan response. So I think there is a foundation of it for dealing with Russia and China, but in our dealings with most of the rest of the world, I think our policies have fallen victim to partisanship.
Well, let me push you on that just a bit. I agree. But I am remembering 21 years ago, after 9/11, when the language in the press and everywhere was, America is under attack. I remember that vividly. I was then in Congress. I was actually walking toward the dome of the Capitol, which is where the intelligence rooms were then housed, and was pulled back because the Capitol closed, get this, on 9/11. We all take an oath to protect and defend the United States, and we closed down. But at any rate, most people think the dome of the Capitol would have been the site of the 4th airplane, which went down in Pennsylvania. And we really had no evacuation plan. We had no continuation of government plan. I guess in hindsight, if Congress had been taken out, we might have had some kind of better chapter, but that's a little morose humor, so I'll take it back. But
You said that, not
I said
me.
it. I said it. We're not. That's not what we're talking about. But the point was, for a while, for 6 months, we responded as Americans to this attack. And the resolutions that were passed to authorize military action in Afghanistan, we're not talking about Iraq at the moment, Afghanistan, that resolution passed with all but one vote in the Senate and the House. The one person, in case you're interested, is Barbara Lee of Berkeley, California, who still serves in Congress. And I applaud her for a courageous vote, even though I disagreed with it. But then you heard Anya tell you that Bob and I have both written books about U.S. foreign policy in the recent decades, and we both, without consulting each other, came to the same conclusion, which is that the United States over-militarized our response after 9/11. And so, Bob, since your book is clearly more brilliant than my book, I think you should explain why you think this.
Well, I think I would step back from that a step or two and say I think what happened after the end of the Cold War was started with an American overconfidence or hubris, if you will, that we could reshape the world. As the only surviving, as the sole superpower, there have never been anything like it in the history of the world. And it was predominant power in every dimension of power. And I think we felt that we could basically reshape the world in our own image of democracies and human rights and so on. The the problem is we then encountered problems that required the use of the military. For example, first President Bush, ordering the military into Somalia because of the famine. Subsequently, President Clinton ordering the military to Haiti to stop chaos and killing. And then there came others along the way. The problem is, in many of these cases, once we accomplished the original military mission, and this is true both in Iraq and in Afghanistan, we then decided that we owed it to the people of those countries, to bring a different, better form of government. And the problem, one of the problems with that is that the military was given that mission, a mission for which it was not trained, a mission for which it was not designed. And the main reason they were given that mission was because of the weakness of the non-military instruments of power in the United States. In 1998, Congress abolished USIA. They wanted to abolish USAID. President Clinton stopped them from doing that, but it basically tucked USAID back in under the State Department in a lesser role. So I think the use of the military came part as an element of our hubris, but then the continuation of, once we accomplished the original mission, in President Bush's case, it was to stop the famine, to feed the people of Somalia. It then morphed into a mission to change the governance of Somalia. Same thing in Haiti. So I think over-militarization, and I probably used that phrase, is actually oversimplification in my view. I think it was a manifestation of some bigger policy decisions that were made, and then the way we got stuck in a lot of these places, or embarrassed in some of these places, was because the military had been given a mission that was actually a civilian responsibility.
You can applaud. I agree. And, oh, by the way, I covered the 90s, too, in my book and made similar points. Surprise. But I would add that in our hubris and our view that we won, they lost, we missed a few things, like the rise of China, which we thought wanted to be just like us. Well, oops. We missed the rise of terrorism. There was a bombing in the garage of the World Trade Center. Does everybody remember that, in 1993, which we fortunately caused very little harm, but that was sort of a precursor. We also missed the rise of Russian grievance. We treated Russia, I'm not defending Russia's behavior, do not mishear me, but at the end of World War II, we were magnanimous to those we defeated. The Marshall Plan and the rest of the way we treated Germany and Japan led to their becoming productive and constructive citizens of the world. And we didn't have that olive branch to Russia. But the one additional point I'd make, and I wonder if you agree, Bob, is in the 90s, there were 3 commissions, I served on one, that predicted a major attack on U.S. soil from this risen terrorism, and no one was listening. And so on 9/10/2001, just try that, I happened to have lunch with Jerry Bremer, L. Paul Bremer, who later became our viceroy in Iraq, but he was the chairman of the commission I served on, and we said, why is no one listening? And the next day, the world changed. I mean, do you agree that we should have been better informed, especially you with your long career in intelligence? Do you think we should have known this was coming?
Sure. And I think at a certain intellectual level, a lot of people did expect an attack, particularly after the attack on the World Trade Center in 1993. And there were several other attacks during the 90s, or planned attacks that would have been really catastrophic. There was one attack that was out of the Philippines that would have brought down something like a half a dozen major U.S. airliners crossing the Pacific. And so there were a number of attacks or planned attacks that were thwarted in the 90s, so we should have known. The problem for democracies, first of all, is that it's tough to galvanize people in the face of a future threat or a theoretical threat. And part of what 9/11 led to in terms of reforms, I don't think you would have gotten the political support to do in prior to 9/11. I'll just give you one example.
Mm-hmm.
So this is one of the, there's been a lot of criticism over the years of the Patriot Act, but I'll give you one example of what the Patriot Act did do. So before the Patriot Act, if I were director of CIA and I had an agent in Cyprus and the FBI had an agent who was connected to that person in New Jersey, and the New Jersey person was called before a grand jury and testified that his buddy in Cyprus was planning an attack on the United States, the FBI guy could not share that information with CIA because it was grand jury derived information. So there are a variety of legal impediments. There are a lot of bureaucratic impediments. Let's just say FBI and CIA were never best of friends. But there were a number of legal impediments to sharing information that were corrected after 9/11. I don't think you would have gotten the political support to change those things until after an attack had taken place. Sad to say.
I think that's fair. And we should have known, or we were investigating some bad guys who were coming from a meeting in Indonesia or someplace to the United States. We lost track of them. They were some of the hijackers. We did not appreciate a memo from an FBI agent in the Midwest who said she'd seen these guys training to fly airplanes but not takeoffs and landings. That was kind of lost. And yes, the pieces of the puzzle were not put together. You're right. And the authorities that we changed made a difference. Another one of those was we reorganized the intelligence community. This is after the flawed intelligence on weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and we set up the Director of National Intelligence, a commander across the intelligence agencies. Let me just ask you about that, because you, at the time we did that, you were about to become Secretary of Defense. What did you think of intelligence reform in 2004?
I thought it was a terrible idea.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that as one of the architects.
Having been Director of Central Intelligence, it seemed to me that, and I actually wrote a very long paper to Susan Collins and Joe Lieberman, who co-chaired the Senate Government Affairs Committee that did this. I felt that with some enhancements of the Director of Central Intelligence position, that you could avoid creating an entire new bureaucracy. And something as easy as giving the Director of Central Intelligence 2 deputies, one for the intelligence community, one for CIA. Would have saved a heck of a lot of time and money. The interesting thing is, in January 2005, President Bush asked me to become the first Director of National Intelligence. And I really thought about it I was president of Texas A&M at the time, and I really thought about it for a couple of weeks. And then I thought to myself, you know, I spent several months last year arguing why this won't work. And now they've come to me because they think I'm the only guy that can make it work. And I don't think so. So I said no. And in one of my great analytical moments, I told my wife after that, this was in January of '05, said, the great news about this is President Bush will never ask me to do anything again.
Well, goes to show, but just for the record, there were 2 House members who also worked on that bill, in addition to Susan Collins and Joe Lieberman. I was one of them, and a guy named Pete Huckstra, then the chairman of the House Intel Committee, I was the ranking Democrat, was the other one. And I have always said, and it is factual, that Susan and I were the 2 women, so of course we did 98% of the work, which is why it came out so well, Bob. At any rate, I think it is working, and we heard from our friend at MI6, I think that he's very pleased with the personnel there, and I think President Biden, we're going to get to President Biden in a minute, has made some very good intelligence appointments. He's nodding, so okay, we're back on course. So let's talk about, I want to ask you more generally about President Biden, but let's talk about the recent trip to Israel and Saudi Arabia. We just had an excellent panel moderated by Jeffrey Goldberg, who is marvelous and has made The Atlantic a fantastic magazine. I don't know if you're here, Jeffrey, but kudos to you. But at any rate, very interested in your assessment of President Biden's trip and what the big drivers were for him making the trip.
I think as I look at it from the outside, it seems to me that there were two drivers, one strategic and one tactical. The strategic driver was the realization that for a variety of reasons, key players in the Middle East who have in the past been some of our closest friends were increasingly open to expanding their relationships with both China and Russia. And in no small part because of their recognition that 3 successive presidents had talked about the United States pulling back in the Middle East. And so in what I would consider a logical hedging strategy, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and others have basically opened their arms in many respects to the Chinese especially, but I would say also to the Russians. And so I think the president was trying to lay down a marker. We're not leaving the Middle East. We are still interested, and so on. The problem is one trip, as opposed to 3 successive presidents of rhetoric of 3 successive presidents and the actions of the United States in pulling back in the region. I think it was useful for him to go and lay down a marker that we're still interested, but that's the beginning of a very long road of restoring those relationships, in my view. And if there's a change in 2024, my guess is we'll be back to square one. The tactical reason was what they said. Basically, can we get cooperation to get oil, to get the Arabs, and particularly Saudi Arabia, to pump more oil? And I guess the question, well, I served on the NSC staff under 4 different presidents, and the question we always had in planning a summit was, what are the deliverables? What's the president going to bring home that made it worth investing his time and energy and so on and so forth? It's not clear to me that there were significant deliverables that were produced by the visit. So I think a lot will depend on what kind of follow-up there is and what kind of longer-range strategy there is in terms of re-engaging in the Middle East and whether we really mean it.
So I think what the White House would say back to you on the tactical or side of this is that there were deliverables that are tangible and meaningful that will last. In Israel, for example, there was an agreement on technology. And Israel is a startup nation. Everybody understands that. So many of the entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley and elsewhere are Israeli or of Israeli origin. That's one. Another one they would say is the beginning of a more, well, I'm going to call that strategic, Iran. I'll get to Iran in a minute. They would say that was one. They would say another one is a meeting with the Palestinians and the restoration of aid to the Palestinians, which Biden had already done, but plus meetings in East Jerusalem, visits to the major Palestinian hospital, a gift of $100 million, which the GCC is matched. I mean, the beginning again of a conversation about a 2-state solution, or as Benny Gantz just said, 2 entities. Okay, they would say that was one. At the meeting in the, I don't work for them, but I've been listening to what they're saying. The meeting in Saudi Arabia, they would say, includes an agreement on technology again, 5G and a development process there. And they would say includes strategic conversations about Iran. On oil, yeah, it was a trip to some extent to get more oil from the Middle East, not just produced to stabilize oil prices, but I think an agenda was to get some of it shipped to Europe, which is going to face grave hardship cutting off its oil from Russia. Problem there, at least as I understand it, is that they don't have that much more oil, and Europe doesn't have the capacity to accept it. So it's kind of confusing why that would have been a major driver. But let's focus on strategy, because I do think that geopolitics were what you said, which are sending a message that we're not leaving. But I also think the other big issue was Iran, and a conversation around Iran's basically reaching breakout, enough enriched uranium to produce a nuclear weapon. It has not yet produced one, so I understand, or hasn't shown even the intention at the moment to produce one. But Iran is an existential threat to Israel, and the whole region is coming around to view it that way. So do you think they made some progress on that?
Well, I think there's been agreement for a while that Iran should not get a nuclear weapon. And I would agree that there were benefits out of the visit to Israel. I was thinking more of the UAE and Saudi Arabia. But I think that the rhetoric masked a very real difference between the president and the acting prime minister, and that is that if President Biden had his druthers, he would return to the JCPOA right now. And that is anathema to the Gulf Arabs and to Israel. And it's one of the reasons that the relationship between those governments and President Obama went to such a low state. And the discussions masked. When President Biden says Iran will not be allowed to have a nuclear weapon, does that mean President Biden is willing to go to war with Iran? And I think if you can't frame that question for the Israeli government, the answer is an unequivocal yes. Israel will not permit Iran to have a nuclear weapon, and they will take care of it militarily if there is no other alternative. I don't think either the Israelis or the Gulf Arabs at this point believe that President Biden is prepared to go to war to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon.
Okay, apparently we're out of time. The timer here is very different, so my apologies, because I wanted to go to questions, but I have to sneak in this last one. I just have to. There is a firm, an advisory firm, I think it's called Rice, Gates, Hadley, and what's her name? Manuel. Yes, I know. And so everybody in this audience wants to know, Bob, what's it like to work with Condi and Anya?
It's intimidating.
Did everybody hear what he said?
But you know, I do take solace in the fact that at one point Condi actually worked for me in the first Bush administration when she was on the NSC staff, and she had the Soviet desk. And we spent a lot of time conspiring against our boss, Scowcroft, particularly when it came to the Soviet Union.
Who is beloved here. Be careful, be careful.
Oh,
he's an icon.
No more beloved than in here. So we go back a long way.
Wasn't that a very appealing answer? Anyway, Bob Gates is going to be around for decades and millennia. That's what I have to say. And we need him. Thank you so much, Bob.
Thank you.